Welcome to Bison Jam, the podcast that covers wide-ranging topics from Yellowstone National Park and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I'm your host, Hugo Sindelar, an assistant professor of film at Montana State University. Today, we're continuing our series about the devastating flood that affected the park and its surrounding gateway communities in June of 2022. In this episode, we are focusing on the flood experience in Yellowstone National Park. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Cam Sholly, the Superintendent of Yellowstone. Thanks so much for joining us today, Cam.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hard to believe it's been almost 2 years, and it's good to be here talking about it.
Great. Let's dive in. Let's start with your journey to Yellowstone National Park. How did you end up as the superintendent?
Well, it's a long story. I was previously the regional director for the Park Service Midwest region, and so that headquarters was based out of Omaha, Nebraska, and we had 61 parks under that region in about 13 states, most of the Midwestern parks between the Dakotas and Ohio. And got when the Trump administration came in, they decided to move some of the executives in the Park Service to different jobs, and got a phone call and said, "You're going to Yellowstone," and that's how that happened.
What was your reaction your first day in the park?
What was the what?
What was your reaction to your first day in the park? You grew up here,
Well,
right?
I've got a long history in Yellowstone. I graduated from Gardner High School in the mid-'80s and started my Park Service career here in the backcountry of Thoroughfare back in 1990. And so this place is near and dear to my heart, and it's a spectacular place. So many people in America and around the globe care about it and the issues here. And I don't think I've ever been in a job that's got so many divergent opinions on everything we're doing or how we're doing it, but that's because people care, and it's an important place, and it's a privilege to be here. I just crossed over into my 6th year as superintendent, so time's gone by quick, and got a lot of good things going on.
So let's jump into the flood event. What's going on the couple days before the flood? So the flood hits in, June 11th, 12th, 13th range. Are you even concerned at that point of an event of this magnitude?
Well, that 2022 was the 150th anniversary year of Yellowstone becoming a national park. So leading into 2022, we'd done, maybe a year to 18 months of planning for kind of commemorating the 150th. And, all of us had just come through 2 years of COVID, and, we had the COVID closure in 2020. And I think the spring of 2022, everybody was thinking this was going to finally be a normal year. And it's great. It's the 150th anniversary. And, we had already done a couple commemoration events and ribbon cuttings. Done a significant amount of tribal engagement, which was one of our main priorities during the 150th. And we really already had a lot of momentum going into that summer. And then, June 13th hits, and it's a reminder of who's actually in charge of this park, and it's not any of us.
So when did you realize that this event was going to be something other than a rainy June weekend?
Well, an unfortunate trend that's happening around the country and happened that year here is late snowfall. Not a lot of snow in the winter of 21-22. I think we got more snow in April and May of 22 than we did in January, February, and March. Anytime you got that kind of late snow, it doesn't really set up in snowpack. And so quickly warming temperatures in June, and then a 3 to 4 day rain event melted. We estimate 4 to 5 inches of snow that came down as, over a 48-hour period with 4 inches of rain on top of it. So all told, you're looking at 8 or 9 inches of rain coming from high elevation up in the Beartooth, and flooded most of, obviously, Soda Butte, Lamar, all of the Gardner River, all the tributaries that flow into the Yellowstone River. The storm, because of the topography and where the storm aligned, hit the north part of the park a lot more severely than the south part of the park. And the hydrology in the rivers up north, because of that topography, is more violent than down south. So if you look at the Yellowstone River coming out of Yellowstone Lake, for instance, or Firehole or Madison Rivers, they went up, but they did not. We did not see the kind of damage down south that we did up north.
So take us through the timeline of the flood, starting when you realize you have to take action to protect life and property. Like when does your team start to take steps to evacuate visitors or make sure roads are closed?
Yeah, I mean, the team did a really good job. I think what happened the night, so that was a Sunday night into a Monday morning, is we started getting a lot of rock fall, and it had been raining for 2 or 3 days at that point. So we had maintenance and law enforcement rangers that were out, clearing the roads from rock slides and things like that. And early in the morning, they started to realize the water levels they were seeing were unprecedented. And hats off to them, because, they basically closed the north entrance road and the northeast entrance road to vehicle traffic, 4 o'clock in the morning-ish. And for those that are familiar with Yellowstone, we get a huge inflow of cars coming in early, usually to go out wildlife watch out at Lamar. And had the rangers and maintenance folks not close those corridors, this is before the roads blew out. We would have definitely had loss of life. And so they were working hard through the night, making the right decisions. I think I woke up at 5, I can't remember exactly when it was, maybe 5:15 in the morning or something, looked at my phone and had a fairly significant number of text messages on my phone. So I'm like, oh, something happened last night. And, got up and started engaging the field staff and the supervisors on what was happening. And we started losing sections of the north entrance road first, and river was just undercutting the road. A lot of the infrastructure in the park was built back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Climate resiliency and things like that weren't necessarily part of the engineering conversation back then. So that road is blown out before in previous floods back in the 70s and that kind of thing, but nothing like we saw on the 13th. We started getting the reports of major sections of road being washed out on the north entrance road, and then shortly thereafter on the northeast entrance road. And, fortunately, like I said, those roads were already closed prior to that happening, but really started then to get the machine going and figuring out, okay, what are the priorities here? First and foremost, you have, somewhere around 10,000 visitors in the park, a couple thousand employees. Is everybody safe? And as far as we could tell at that point, at least with what we knew early in the morning, we did not have people stranded, loss of life, or anything like that we were dealing with. And so we started a fairly aggressive planning conversation around what the emergency response was going to be and what the sequenced actions were going to be that we needed to take to ultimately evacuate the park and secure the northern end and that kind of thing.
So what were some of the steps you did take to evacuate the park in a timely manner?
Well, we knew no one could drive out of either one of the north or northeast entrances. So we pushed, I think around 9 o'clock, we decided to push all of the visitors that were up north down to the south end of the park. And then we started getting damage reports from the south that weren't as substantial as the north, but a lot of, potential road failures and things like that, concerned about bridges and those types of things, and wastewater treatment facilities overflowing, all of the types of infrastructure you need to safely host visitation. So we made a decision after we pushed everybody south around, I think, 11 o'clock or so, we decided to go ahead and evacuate the entire park. And so everybody did a great job. We got the park, for the most part, cleared in about 24 hours of all visitors. We moved a lot of the employees from here in Mammoth down south also. we have 8 or 10 wastewater systems in the park that we manage. The wastewater here in Mammoth was piped under the road to Gardner's plant. And so that got severed wherever we lost the road. So we had a couple 100,000 gallons of wastewater flowing into the Gardner River. Lost power. So that first, 24, 36 hours, we were in here operating off of a Honda generator that was out there on that little porch out there with 2 extension cords coming in, one to run a lamp, one to run the computer. And, it's interesting. We, first and foremost focus on securing the park, getting communications. Everything's obviously pretty chaotic in those situations. Realized that, we also simultaneously had a couple thousand visitors trapped in Gardner because they couldn't get into the park. The water was over Highway 89 at Yankee Gym, so they couldn't get to Livingston. And then we also had residents and visitors trapped at Cook City and Silvergate. And of course, those communities needed help. And so we started, both focusing on what we needed to do to safely evacuate the park, make sure everybody's safe in the park, and working with those communities to make sure they're safe and they knew what the plan was and that kind of thing. We were juggling a little bit that morning, that first day or so.
When did you see those aerial videos that came out? Were you in that helicopter?
No, well, so our helicopter was on a fire. I think it was in Idaho. I recalled it, and then it took a couple hours for it to get back to the park. And then I'd asked them to fly the corridor between here and Gardner to see what because we hadn't gone eyes on all the damage at that point, and so the helicopter was able to, the one that we released on YouTube, fly the entire canyon and really give us a good idea of the severity of the damage that we were dealing with. And we purposely got that video out as quickly as possible so people understood that it wasn't a little thing.
Did you ever think you'd see flooding like that in Yellowstone when you took?
Yeah, it's not a park that's known for its flooding. It's had floods before. I think the last major flood was in '97. The cubic feet per second of the Yellowstone River was, I think, 32,000 CFS. And at peak in 2022, it was just over 50,000 CFS. So, and then we got a report, I think, from the National Weather Service that there was another storm potentially coming later or in a few days. And so our concern was that we'd have this massive flood that happened on the 13th. The waters would recede a little bit, and then we'd have another one coming later that week.
So at what point do you make the decision to close the park?
After we pushed everybody south, and then we started getting the damage reports from some of the areas in the southern loop, it was just too distracting to try to work around the emergency with thousands of visitors running around. And, I know that there's a lot of people that are upset by that decision, but probably one of the better decisions that we made was evacuating the whole park. We just needed to reset. We needed to make sure we had the engineers in to evaluate, inspect all the bridges. We had several sections of road that didn't collapse until like a day or two after the flood event. And so we also had near wastewater facility kind of crashes at Canyon and Old Faithful, where the amount of rainwater coming into the system was overwhelming the capacity of those systems. And so you just can't have people flushing toilets and, maintain clean drinking water and that kind of thing under those conditions. At least it's risky. So, it was a pretty, it's not a inconsequential decision to evacuate Yellowstone in the summer. I mean, it's, you've got obviously the public safety issues, but you've also got a lot of corporations and people in hotels and restaurants, and there's a big financial ramification to that, as well as people that have, in many cases, taken their trip of a lifetime to Yellowstone, and some of them have saved money for years, and they're finally here, and you wake up and tell them to leave. It's not, even though I think most people understood, I think the difficulty was communicating how serious it was to the people in the South, because there was places at Old Faithful and others, and they're not seeing the wastewater systems overflowing. It's raining, but the roads, you can still drive on them. They don't know what's going on up here up north. They don't have the full picture. So from wherever they were in the park, it might seem like a storm. Right. And so we started getting this, you guys are premature and evacuating. This isn't that big of a deal type of thing, which is one of the main reasons I released that YouTube video of the canyon that day, which I think got like 17 million hits in a pretty short amount of time or something like that.
What was your reaction to that video? Someone that has lived in the park, lived in this area?
Yeah, I think the first thought that came across my mind was, well, number one, grateful that the people hadn't died. And if you look at some of those videos, the roads in perfect condition, and then suddenly it drops 80 feet into the river. And if those guys hadn't closed the roads early in the morning, there's no question there would have been loss of life, because you're literally driving down the road, it looks fine, it's dark out, and then you're in a raging river. And so that I was grateful that no one, at least at that point, we knew that had not lost their lives or been seriously injured. I think the second thing was about, aside from what are the next steps we need to take, it was a little bit of, we'd been through a couple tough years with COVID. Park was closed for 2 months in 2020. 21 was kind of a rebound year for the businesses, and these communities really live and die on the tourism in Yellowstone. I felt bad for the communities that here we thought we were going to have a great kind of back to normal season, and overnight, especially for Cook City, Silvergate, and Gardner, that gets turned upside down. And so I felt bad for them. I also knew that kind of later in the day, maybe the next day on Tuesday, realized that there was a good chance that we could get a bunch of the southern part of the park open as quickly as possible. I mean, these two northern corridors were going to be time consuming. I think most of the people's apprehension was around how many years is it going to take to reconnect the communities. But we put a good plan together, and we did a press conference, I think either Monday night or Tuesday of that week, and I can't remember how many outlets we had on it, but it was I think 75 to 100 outlets from around the country, and people were interested in what was happening, and I think we erred on the side of this could be a really long recovery, not wanting to kind of overpromise and underdeliver. And then we spent that week really putting a plan together to kind of sequence getting as much of the park open as we could while working on a short-term recovery plan for the north end.
Yeah, so let's talk about getting the park open as quick as you could, because you used an interesting system that allowed access pretty quickly. You were closed for
8 days. So what we did was once we understood what the amount of damage down south was, like there was 2 locations we had to do major work. We had to do some resetting on our wastewater systems and water systems. We had to have, I think we had 17 engineers in here inspecting different bridges and things like that. All the things you want to do before you put traffic back on roads and people back in accommodations or whatever the case is. And we realized that we can open the South Loop pretty fast. We got it reopened in 8 days. Leading into that, we were like, okay, the park gets 1 million people a month in the summer months, and now you've got half the road mileage unavailable. So you can't put 1 million people a month into half the park's road mileage. I mean, it's already overcrowded many times, even with all 475 miles of road open, let alone you cut it in half. Now what are you going to do? And so we built, with some good help from some of our Park Service offices and some private contractors, a reservation system for visitors within 3 days. One of the things we did the first day, just kind of backing up, is started these community calls where we were having information about kind of what's happening and what people are thinking. Those conversations were very different with Gardner and Cook City than they were with Jackson, Cody, and West Yellowstone. The conversations with the communities down south was, hey, when can you open? Our entrances didn't get washed out. The conversations up here were more like, we know you can't get open soon, but we're still stranded down here. Can you help us? And we had, contingency plans to fly our helicopter and fly food supplies in if we needed to Gardner and Cook City. We were working with the state of Montana and had National Guard assets available if they needed resupply. But back on the reopening, we were doing these community calls with the southern, kind of West Yellowstone, Jackson Hole, Cody, explaining to them, yeah, we can get open, but we can't get open like normal. So we've got this reservation system. What do you all think? And very negative response to it. They were like, we don't want a reservation system. The primary reason they didn't want the reservation system was if you're an Airbnb or VRBO owner or hotel owner, they were afraid that, they get reservations sometimes a year in advance, that the people that had made reservations in their accommodations wouldn't be able to get a reservation on the new reservation system and would cancel. And so I said, what do you want to do? Something's got to happen. And this business owner in West Yellowstone, there was like 650 people on this one call, and he's like, Cam, this is Ron. Can you look at the email I sent you? I don't want to say it in front of all the, on the call here. And I'm like, sure, Ron, I'll look at it later. I got home that night. Yeah, I think it was like a Thursday night or so, Friday night maybe, later in that week. And I pull up Ron's email and it says, back in the mid-'70s, we had gas rationing around the country. And if the last digit of your license plate was odd, you could get gas on odd days of the calendar. If it was even, you can get gas on even days of the calendar. Why don't you just do that with visitors? And I'm like, I remember it was like midnight. I was back at my house. And I'm thinking, that's got to be the dumbest idea I've ever heard in my life. And then I woke up in the morning and was talking to my wife, and she's like, that could be brilliant. That could work. I'm like, yeah, you know what? It could. Plus, it's not my idea. It's not a federal idea. So if it doesn't work, it came from the communities, right? And so we took that idea that morning and socialized it with all three communities again. And they're like, oh yeah, that's great. It gives us, better predictability, and, you're guaranteed that, if you're there for 4 days, you get 2 days in the park, and the other 2 days you go shopping or fly fishing outside the park or rafting or whatever the case is. And so we started what we called ALPS, the alternating license plate system, and got all the messaging and everything set up. And 8 days later, reopened the Southern Loop under the ALPS system.
And that ended up working out so well that you could open the whole park later on, right? Open to all license plates, I mean.
It depends on, from the standpoint of, did it do the job that it was meant to do?
Yeah.
It was incredible. It worked perfectly. But it didn't take long for the wheels to start wobbling on that one. And so we worked under ALPS on the South Loop only. So for people, that's basically, west entrance, south entrance, east entrance, Old Faithful to Madison to Norris to Canyon to Lake to Grant Village for about 12 days, 14 days almost maybe, in that range. In the meantime, we were able to clear everything we needed to on the northern loop. So not the northeast entrance road, not the north entrance road, but the northern loop. Okay. And based on the numbers that we were seeing that first 10 days or so, once we opened the northern loop, we felt we could drop the license plate restriction. So we only had that in place for, probably less than 2 weeks before we opened up the northern loop. And we kind of divided the park into an operational zone and then a flood recovery zone. And, we continued to move through different gates. So we opened up South Loop, did everything we could to open the North Loop. And then it was like, can we get people to Slough Creek? Because there was no road damage there on the Northeast Entrance Road. So we set up a little day use visitor reservation system there. And so, I think we pivoted pretty well when we needed to. Everybody came together and did a good job. We had 93% of the park open in, 20 days or so. So I think, and we salvaged a good part of that summer. You could have argued, I had people saying you should never have opened the park. And I'm like, could have taken that approach, but we didn't need to take that approach. And, it ended up working out, and the team did a good job. The communities adjusted, and we put our full focus on getting the two northern entrances reconnected before winter.
Right. So what's your focus at that point? You've opened the park, dropped the ALP system, and then you still have communities that are cut off or don't have the visitation in Gardner, Cook City. So what are you doing to support those communities and try to get them access?
Yeah, it was tough because they knew they couldn't come in by vehicle overall. We did a bunch of things, and I like to think we gave them something back for that summer. I think it was a little easier for Gardner, and I say that from the standpoint that when we had the engineers looking through at the canyon damage, they were like, "There's no chance that can be fixed quickly. You're talking years and years." And we had this old Gardner Road, which was a one-lane dirt road from, it was a stagecoach road from 1879. And we quickly started talking to Federal Highways about, can we make that the temporary road? And initially, and so before that happened, we had our crews in Yellowstone put almost 20,000 tons of material on that road. Now that road was impassable 3 days after the flood because it was so saturated. You couldn't even get 4x4s up. So I had a lot of people like, "Oh, I've driven that road since I was a kid. And yeah, you can get up and down." I'm like, okay, you haven't driven it after a major flood event. So we put 20,000 tons of material on it with the Park Service roads crew to get it passable to one-way traffic each way.
Was that an easy decision for you to pivot to that road, or did you feel
it was the only way to go? The alternative was Gardner would be disconnected from the park for years.
So that was your only solution?
It was the only solution. We're really lucky that road was there. And, we have probably 100 employees that live in Gardner that work in the park. We have kids in the park that need to get to school in Gardner. And, we're very connected, to Gardner from that perspective. So, there wasn't a lot of options. And so first and foremost was, can we get that road to a point where we can have safe, at least one-way traffic back and forth? And we set that up pretty quickly. It took from June 13th to July 1st for us to get it in a condition that it was now kind of a one-lane asphalt road. And we set up these traffic windows where, at the top of the hour, there's an inbound, bottom of the hour, there's an outbound from up here, only for employees. We couldn't handle 3,000 cars a day type of deal, which is the normal traffic flow there. Concurrently working with Federal Highways to see what was possible for making that road kind of the permanent temporary fix, so to speak. I mean, I don't think anybody that lived through 2022 wanted to see years and years of traffic windows. And federal highways initially was, we're not sure. We've never built a road that quickly anywhere in this country. And, we worked closely with them. They were right there with us, and they developed a plan to 2-lane and pave that road before winter. And back to your question about what we did with, to try to get these communities access was, we have a considerable number of wildlife guides and fishing guides that are under kind of commercial authorizations with us, so they can bring clients in and, take them out with wildlife guides and things like that. We didn't have the time to, like I said, allow visitors to come in because those traffic lines would have been forever. They never would have gotten through the window. Everything would have been gridlocked. But we felt like, you've got these wildlife guides that have 5 people in a Suburban, and we know they're under contract with us, so to speak. They're partners. They understand the park. They understand what's going on. Can we let some of them in? And then that would give some visitor access from Gardner. And so that's what we did. And that worked well. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but that allowed the wildlife guides to get, Bozeman, Livingston, Gardner, clients that were already in the books. They could say, no, you don't need to cancel. We can still get in. It became kind of a unique opportunity for the visitors, the limited number of visitors, because no one else could come in the north entrance. Yeah. And so the other things we did is we did allow, obviously, the people to walk in on foot and bike in. Like, we opened up the 6 miles over there at Cook City, Silvergate, so people could bike and hike into the park up until the point where the damage was occurring. And then we worked with Federal Highways, and they began the 2-lane build process on July 6th, so just under a month from the flood. And they finished that 2-lane October 31st. So, it's steep, it's curvy. There's people that complain about it all the time, but I'm like, it's better than no road.
Yep.
So
you described that week after the flood and kind of the period after that as kind of your longest week. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think if you look at everything I just outlined, I mean, from the get-go, evacuating the park, is everybody safe? So much damage everywhere. Community visitors stranded in communities, wastewater dumping into the Gardner River, power's out. It's really one of those situations where you don't even know where to start. You're just kind of like, okay. It's overwhelming is not even the right word. This team did a fantastic job. We got organized very, very quickly, but it was very, very long days that entire week and beyond, and massive amounts of stress. You've got people on these calls in Gardner, what are you going to do to help us type of thing. Fortunately, the water receded on 89, and we were able to get the visitors out that way, I think by Tuesday. But, if you're feeling the pressure of a ton of people's livelihoods on your shoulder based on the actions that you take, it's a long week or weeks. You can't respond to everybody, and you do the best you can trying to communicate what you're doing, and you're hoping your plan's going to work. And, fortunately it did. We were really, really lucky that we had good weather that October. Everybody that lives around here knows in October it can be pretty hit or miss as far as snow and that kind of thing. You can't pave when it's below 40 degrees. I mean, doesn't work out too well. And so the fact that we had a really nice October allowed that contractor the extra month to get the guardrail in. There's over a mile of guardrail on that road. get the road paved, get it striped, all the things you need, signs up. And, but, that whole 4-month period is just a blur.
How do you get that all coordinated to set up a road in 4 months?
Well, we developed the plan in the park. I said we kind of divided the park into an operations zone, which was down south, and then we moved it north as we could. And then we had this flood recovery zone. So we had two very kind of different operating planning models going. And then the right team members kind of working to either manage the operation and all the different dynamics, whether it's Alps or, we think this bridge is going to fail down there, we need to look at it, or whatever the case is. And then up north, we had a great partner in Federal Highways, and we had fantastic contractors. I mean, HK Contractors worked on the North Road, on the North Entrance Road. A company called Oftedal worked on the Northeast Entrance Road. Both are super experienced at building roads and moving materials and doing it quickly. And those companies they took the challenge and got it done. I mean, it was pretty incredible what happened in a very short amount of time.
Is that going to be the permanent road, or are you guys moving towards plans for something else? What does it look like for the North Entrance Road in the future?
So in the fall of 2022, I asked for, not that you would, but where could you build a road from here to Gardner? Where's it engineering wise possible to build a road? And they came up with about 6 different alternatives. The old Gardner Road was built quickly. It wasn't built to modern day standards. It's safe, but there's a lot of engineering that would have to be done to make that into like the permanent road. And taking into consideration also the fact that soil shifting, there's going to be some pretty significant engineering considerations on top of habitat and visual and all the things we look at. Probably one of the biggest downfalls of improving that road to permanent is it would take 3 to 5 years of 30-minute traffic delays for years and years and years, probably some nighttime closures. So there would be, if we chose that, we're analyzing it, very significant impacts on visitors, employees, families coming in and out of the park for the duration. And then, we'll look at rebuilding through the canyon. I have no doubt that we can build a structure that will be resilient to a future flood. But if people have been on that road, they also know there's pretty significant rock fall, pretty significant cliff faces. It's expensive through the canyon. It'd be, multiple bridge structures going through. It'd be a lot of work that'd have to occur in the river in order for that to happen. There's habitat concerns with bighorn sheep and others. So we'll look at that. And then we've got this hybrid, which is kind of split in the middle, that we'll also evaluate. But so we've teed up 3 alternatives that we're considering. We'll launch an environmental assessment this year, and we should have a decision by early next year. We have the money in the bank. The administration and Congress responded very quickly as far as long-term flood recovery funds. So we have, $900 million that we can spend on the long-term permanent solutions in both corridors and some other investments for resiliency and that kind of thing for the future.
So maybe talk a little bit about the effect of this event directly on the workers in Yellowstone and the staff. I think, visitors are appreciative of the restoration of access, and so are businesses, but a lot of people that are making that happen were affected themselves.
Yeah, I mean, these parks are, everybody's like, you're so lucky to live in Yellowstone, and we are. The novelty of working in parks sometimes wears off pretty quickly. I always say, if you want to have a good time, go to Canyon or Grant Village in the winter and live in, we're doing a lot of improvements in housing, but, sometimes substandard housing conditions, snowmobile an hour and a half each way for your groceries, and potentially live in an area that doesn't have very good connectivity, and and then get pounded by 4.5 million visitors in a 4 or 5 month period. And, it takes a toll on the workforce. And you've got a visitation trend now that's going up. You've got a staffing trend that's flat, sometimes declining year by year. And that delta between those two is impact. And that impact many times shows up in the form of very stressed workforces and overworked people that are, people don't think about what's it take to clean 700 bathrooms 3 times a day instead of 1, or empty 2,000 garbage cans 4 times a day instead of 2, or, you've got to have people to manage people. You throw a flood into that, life things like I can't get my kid to basketball practice, or, I've got to drive an hour and a half to get groceries now instead of going to Gardner, or, my parents have a business and they make 95% of their revenue between May and September. And now they're not going to make anything. And, those are all things that weigh heavily on people, whether they're on the team in the Park Service or, working in these communities or whatever the case is.
So what do you think are the biggest lessons that you take away from the 2022 flood?
I think first and foremost, if you look at it from the positive side, I say to the team here, have the relationships before you need them. I think the team has done a really good job of, and part of this is because of COVID and other things we've been through, great relationships, not across the board. Not everybody likes us. I get it. But, very good relationships with our partners, in the park, out of the park. I think anytime you go through incidents like that, it does draw you closer with people because you're going through something that's pretty tough. And, as tough as that was for everyone, we got through it. And so I think that's a lesson in having relationships that are strong enough to withstand and transcend very difficult periods of time. And I think that's a big lesson. I think another lesson back on the kind of resiliency, every place that we lost a section of road, if people know what riprap is, it's basically when you see a slope of boulders next to a road base. And there's different sizes of riprap. Every place we had riprap along the road corridors, we didn't lose. And most of the sections that at least were in curves on the rivers where there was no riprap, we got blown out. And so I think, is there a lesson learned there in regard to proactive actions that Yellowstone or other parks can take to, for relatively cheap amounts of money, or not extravagant amounts of money, shore up their infrastructure to prevent, massive damage like we saw in 2022. Like if we had the foresight back in 2017 or 18 or 19 or whatever the case is to say, we've got these roads sitting right on these rivers, and at some point they're going to flood. And we know we've rip-wrapped some of the sections, so we obviously know that there could be a problem at some point. We didn't finish the job. Are there things that are out there right now that we should be proactively addressing because something may happen next year or 5 years from now? So I think it's maybe opened our minds a little bit, or opened our eyes a little bit around vulnerability and what types of threats there might be that we're not really thinking about. And how do you get yourself more into a proactive state of mind instead of a reactive state of mind, so to speak?
Where does the recovery stand today? We talked a little bit about, designing the new road, but there were other sections of road that are washed out across the park. Where do you guys stand on your repairs park-wide after this event?
I already mentioned what we're going to be doing long-term planning-wise on the North Entrance Road. We're putting about $250 million into wastewater system improvements. A lot of those systems were built in the 70s and 80s or later, back when visitation was, 2.5 million or so. Now it's 4.5 million. So you've got to upgrade those systems. Northeast Entrance Road, the repairs that were done on those sections are probably much, much stronger than the road was before. In fact, we were kind of joking the other day. I mean, you really can't undo those. They're not really temporary fixes. If anybody's been on the Northeast Entrance Road at Trout Lake or at Soda Butte picnic area, they're probably more, they'll be if there's a 1 in 1,000 year event, they're going to be the sections that live. Yeah. But we do have some plans for the Northeast Entrance Road. We're doing this $120 million Yellowstone River Bridge replacement. That will be in year 2 of 3 of that this year. And then we're going to be, focused on, are there some sections of the road in that Northeast corridor that need to be maybe moved away from the river? Or where are the sections that need more riprap to protect the roads? Pebble Creek Campground was significantly impacted, so there's going to need to be, some restoration work that gets done over time and things like that. But I'd say wastewater treatment improvements, getting the road built from here to Gardner, and then looking at what we need to do from here to Cook City is going to be kind of on the long-term recovery agenda.
In that new North Entrance Road, how much is that going to cost to build and the timeline to construct?
It depends on which one we pick.
Okay.
My guess is you're in the $200 to $400 million range for any one of the alternatives. I think the Canyon's probably the most expensive. 3 to 5 years is probably the timeline for any of them.
And you talked a little bit about resiliency. Is climate change a part of the resiliency conversation with you guys? Because
it has to be. I mean, anyone that thinks this quote unquote 1 in 500 year flood event is not going to happen for another 500 years. I mean, maybe that's true. What I do know is that it would be very irresponsible to spend $400 million to rebuild a road that in 10 years washes out again. So, we need to take our time, understand that these types of events are going to happen in the future. Let's build a solution, hopefully, that is resilient to, it could be climate change, it could be rock falls, it could be earthquakes, who knows what the case is. We are sitting on one of a fairly large volcano. Of course, if that goes off, it won't really matter. But we want to get it right. We've got some time, and we'll evaluate what the impacts are on the resources of the park and each of the corridors. What are the visual impacts? What are the engineering considerations? What are the costs? All those things.
And are you concerned about flooding in the future? You've talked a little bit sometimes about the shifts in your weather, when precipitation falls, how it falls. Can you share a little bit about how that picture might be changing for the park?
Well, it's not just changing here. I mean, it's changing everywhere. And, I think that it's going to become, we're already seeing it happen. I mean, 21, we had some of the lowest water levels since the 30s, some of the warmest water temperatures since the 30s. I was asked to go down to Lake Mead for a bit back in 21 and help them map out about $160 million of projects to move their marinas and their launch ramps because of the lowering water levels in Lake Mead. And it's no longer really an abstract conversation. And what I mean by that is there are people I know that I would say weren't necessarily climate deniers, maybe some of them, but would ignore it wasn't affecting them. When you suddenly tell a $1 billion, $2 billion boating industry, you can no longer launch your boat on Lake Mead, or when you start telling anglers that you had to close the waters in Yellowstone because the water, temperatures were too high and the fish were stressed, people start realizing that's actually a kind of a tangible impact of climate change. And so I think, back on what we're going to be doing here, we're doing a lot of climate modeling. It's got to be incorporated into any of these major investments that we're doing. And it'd be irresponsible not to. I don't really care what people think, if they believe it or not. There's no question, and it's happening more and more. There's no question in my mind that same dynamic could happen again very quickly. And we just don't want to be spending massive amounts of money just to have to do it all over again in the future.
Can you explain what you mean by that dynamic for listeners?
Well, I mean, the dynamic being that and look, modeling's different. Modeling's not always right. There's plenty of modeling I've seen that, over the last 20 years, it hasn't come true. Yeah. There's plenty of the world's going to come to an end in 5 years type of stuff. That extreme modeling, I don't necessarily buy into, and I think it's been proven many times that sometimes and it's not an exact science, but we overestimate what some of the impacts are going to be. They're slower, they're going to happen over time, but we are seeing them more and more often now. And I think that's going to be the trend into the future. And that dynamic the dynamic of, especially when it comes to flooding, if you look at not this winter, but last winter, so the winter of 22, 23, we had a foot of snow drop the week after we opened the road here. And we didn't fall below 40 degrees or above 40 degrees between November and April. And we got a considerable amount of precipitation, normal snowpack, a fairly normal spring with a gradual warm up that melted the snowpack the way it has in the past. And those years will happen. Versus little to no snow like this year throughout the main winter. And then I think we've gotten more snow in the last 2 weeks here in Yellowstone than we have since October. And so some of that won't necessarily become, the snowpack that you want to see under kind of historically normal conditions. And if you end up getting a similar setup where a 4-day storm comes in and it warms up to 65 degrees, then guess what? The same thing's going to happen. So I think us being cognizant of those possibilities when we're planning, I don't care if it's a visitor center down in Florida that's on the shoreline, or, work we're doing with, longer fire seasons and hotter fire seasons, or, our modeling for flooding or any of those types of things, whether that's in Yellowstone or wherever, we've got to take it seriously, and we've got to try to do the best we can to get something that's not an exact science as right as possible.
And so how does that modeling translate to real world changes in infrastructure? What do you build it bigger? Do you build it wider? What are you seeing so far in how you're recovering from this flood and other new infrastructure you're building?
Well, I mean, I think the benefit of technology and advancements in, how we build things now it's a lot better than it was in the 40s and 50s. So if you're building a bridge in a flood-prone river corridor, we have engineering solutions that can ensure that structure withstands at least some certain level of flooding or whatever the case is, or seismic retrofits or whatever that might be. And I think unless you're in a place that doesn't have any type of natural disaster, hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, whatever the case is, earthquakes, whatever, your engineering solutions have to continue to develop with the potential threats that you're seeing, and take every bit of advantage that you can to strengthen those facilities, and with the right decision making around where you put them. And obviously that comes at a cost. If you're going to build some multiple bridges in the Gardner River Canyon to withstand another 1 in 500 year flood, you're going to have probably more beams going into bedrock, and you might use stronger materials. You're going to do it differently than you might if you're just building a normal bridge somewhere else. I don't know.
Is flooding more on your radar than it was when you started here?
Well, I mean, it's got to be. I wasn't paying. This place didn't flood. Seldom, And there was no, and this isn't a hit on the National Weather Service, or no one predicted it. And we weren't under some big flood watch. I don't know what we would have done if we had been under a flood watch. I don't think anybody would have predicted it was going to be this severe. But, I think if you're, like I said, in Yosemite, they can have multiple floods in a decade time frame, in Yosemite Valley to different degrees. And, if you're in a location where tornadoes are coming every spring or hurricanes are coming every July or whatever the case is, it becomes part of your mindset. If you're in a place where it never happens and then it does, you're going to see a mindset shift. You got to be thinking about it.
What do you think the legacy of the 2022 flood is going to be? And what's your hope for the future after this event?
I don't know. I'll leave that up to other people, historians or whatever the case is. I think in recent memory, in Yellowstone's history, everybody remembers the 88 fires. Even though that was, 36 years ago, 30, whatever it is. People talk about it all the time. Right. And, I think this will be the same to some degree. I think I get asked regularly on the comparisons between the 88 fires and the 22 floods. They're not really comparable aside from, they're a major response and major recovery efforts. The 88 fires started slow and built up and, got to a really massive stage, there in September, whereas this all happened overnight. I don't know what the legacy of the flood is aside from, I'm sure that since we're going to be doing recovery work for the next decade, probably, that, people will see that happening. It'll stay kind of in the forefront of the mind. Decades from now, it'll be, this is what happened. And there's been plenty of people documenting how it happened and why it happened and what the response and recovery was. And, I'll let other people judge how good of a job we did.
Are there any silver linings from such a devastating event for the park?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. So the term silver lining is kind of a cliche. I think, is it an opportunity to bring to the forefront some of these, climate issues that are facing us, or the changes in conditions? Probably. Is it an opportunity to, this park, contrary to the media narrative that the park's being overrun by visitors, the park's 2.2 million acres, less than 2,000 acres are pavement. And somewhere around 97% of the people in this park or visitors never get more than a half mile away from their car. And so you got a really big problem in a really small percentage of the park. It's important that the infrastructure you have is safe. And like I said, most of the infrastructure was built back early to mid last century. So is it an opportunity to modernize and think about the future and ensure that, access and enjoyment, which is a big part of our mission, and it's in a very small percentage of this park, that we have the ability to upgrade infrastructure to continue to be successful in that into the future.
The flood's really, the amount of teamwork that went into recovering this flood is extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah. And we were fortunate. I mean, I know there's contractors out there that all have special expertise, and obviously some are better than others. We've had some contractors in the park that are probably not ready to be contractors in this park. It's just, you got to know what you're doing. And we were very fortunate to get those two contractors because, they really knew what they were doing, and Federal Highways did a great job with the contracts. And, had you had a contractor that maybe wasn't as familiar with building roads and things like that, could have easily not gotten done in time. And the ramifications of not getting this Old Gardner Road done we would have had to probably put kids into the West Yellowstone school system from here in Mammoth. We would have had to plow from here to Mammoth for access in and out. That would have screwed up all the winter use and snowmobiling, snow coaches and things like that. So there's a lot of pressure on those timelines to get those roads reconnected.
Anything else?
That's it.
All right. Well, Cam, thank you so much for joining us on the Bison Jam podcast today. It was a pleasure to talk with you. And for our listeners, be sure to follow along as we continue to explore stories of the 2022 flood in future episodes. Thanks so much for listening today, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. Thanks so much, Cam. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
That was fun.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks, buddy.
Good to meet
You got to pack all this stuff up.
Oh, yeah.
There's the elevator,
Yeah.
I saw you humping it up the stairs.
Bison Jam is a production of Hugo Sindelar Media, LLC. I'm the director and producer, and Ashley LeBow is our editor and story consultant. This episode was filmed by Leif Everson. Our guest was the Superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, Cam Sholly. And we'd like to thank Rachel Cudmore and Evan Hubbard for their help setting up this episode. Additional support for this podcast comes from Montana State University. Be sure to listen to future episodes wherever you find your favorite podcasts, and we'll see you soon.